The air in the grand ballroom of the Elysium Hotel was a thick, shimmering tapestry woven from 1,000 whispered aspirations and the heavy perfume of success. Crystal chandeliers, each an inverted constellation of light, dripped brilliance onto marble floors that mirrored the ceiling, creating a dizzying illusion of endless opulence. Gowns of silk and velvet, cut to flatter every curve, swirled past tuxedos tailored with an almost surgical precision, their wearers adorned with jewels that caught and refracted the light into blinding flashes. Among this constellation of the country's elite, a man named Arthur Vance felt as conspicuous as a single, rough-hewn stone in a jeweler's display of polished diamonds. He clutched a small, unassuming package, wrapped in simple brown paper, tied with a length of twine. It was modest, almost anachronistic, amidst the ostentatious displays of wealth. Every polished surface, every gleaming reflection, seemed to amplify the stark contrast between his quiet presence and the roaring extravagance that engulfed him. He felt the subtle shift in conversations as he passed, the fleeting glances that lingered a fraction too long, the barely perceptible tightening of smiles. His gift, nestled protectively in his hands, was not just cheap. It was an act of defiant humility in a room that celebrated nothing but excess. This wasn't just a matter of social discomfort. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss of judgment, with his daughter's future hanging precariously in the balance. The gala was an annual charity event, a glittering ritual where the wealthy vied for prestige through extravagant donations, silent auction bids on items of impossible luxury, and public pledges that echoed through the vast hall like thunder. Arthur, a single father whose life was a ceaseless ballet of juggling shifts, school runs, and bedtime stories, had secured an invitation through a fluke, a small scholarship program Lily had applied for, unbeknownst to him, which had granted a limited number of community representatives access to the charity auction. Lily, with her bright, inquisitive eyes and an imagination as boundless as the cosmos, was his entire world, his singular reason for enduring the suffocating scrutiny of this gilded cage. The gift he carried, a meticulously hand-carved miniature oak tree with tiny, almost imperceptible squirrels and birds nestled in its branches, was a testament to countless late nights, his calloused hands working under the soft glow of a bedside lamp after Lily had drifted to sleep. It was crafted from a fallen branch he'd found on one of their Sunday walks. Each leaf, each tiny creature, a symbol of their shared resilience, their quiet moments of joy. Its material value was negligible, perhaps a few dollars for the wood and tools, but its emotional weight for Arthur was immeasurable. It represented love, effort, and sacrifice, values that seemed utterly alien in this temple of material worship. Arthur's life was a testament to quiet struggle and unwavering devotion. He worked as a carpenter, his days spent shaping wood into functional beauty, earning an honest, if modest, living. His hands, though skilled, were perpetually stained with sawdust and marked with the small nicks and scars of his trade. A stark contrast to the manicured, unblemished hands that delicately held flutes of champagne around him. He lived in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of the city, a place filled with Lily's artwork, the scent of baking, and the comforting creak of old floorboards. The invitation had arrived unexpectedly, a thick cream envelope, emblazoned with the prestigious emblem of the Wainwright Foundation, a philanthropic arm of the colossal Wainwright conglomerate. It spoke of community spirit and charitable giving, but Arthur knew the real currency here wasn't good intentions, but cold, hard cash. He had debated not coming, feeling the weight of his inadequacy pressed down on him. But Lily, in her innocent wisdom, had urged him. "Dad," she had said, her voice soft but firm, "your carvings are beautiful. Someone will see how much care you put into it." Her unwavering belief was the only reason he had dared to step foot into this bewildering alien world. He hoped against all rational thought that his contribution, humble as it was, might somehow make a difference, perhaps catch the eye of someone who valued genuine craftsmanship, or more importantly, someone who recognized the silent plea for a brighter future for children like Lily, whose scholarship prospects were tied to the Foundation's generosity. The problem, glaring and unavoidable, was the chasm between expectation and reality. Every glance he intercepted, every hushed aside, spoke volumes. The gift table, where items for the silent auction were displayed, was a dazzling array of luxury. There was an antique pocket watch, silver encrusted with sapphires, valued at tens of thousands. Beside it, a limited edition painting by a renowned contemporary artist, its price tag astronomical. Rare wines, exotic vacation packages, bespoke jewelry that seemed to pulse with an inner light, all contributed to an atmosphere where only the most exclusive, the most expensive, dared to reside. Arthur's carefully wrapped package felt like a deliberate insult in this context. He imagined the disdain, the polite but cutting dismissal it would receive. A tall, impeccably dressed woman with a diamond choker that seemed to defy gravity swept past him, her eyes flicking over his brown paper package with an expression of barely concealed amusement, before dismissing him entirely to greet an arriving dignitary. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks, a familiar sting of embarrassment. But he pushed it down. He wasn't here for himself, he was here for Lily. But he couldn't shake the question that gnawed at him. Why him? Why was a simple carpenter with a handmade wooden sculpture invited to an event designed for billionaires and their trophies? There had to be something more, a hidden layer beneath the gilded surface. But what it was, he couldn't even begin to guess. As he made his way towards the designated display area for the silent auction items, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of sophisticated conversations, the occasional burst of appreciative laughter. It all felt like a stage performance he hadn't rehearsed for. He spotted the auction coordinator, a stern-faced woman in a severe black dress, clipboard in hand, but overseeing the meticulous arrangement of the high-value items. Her assistant, a young man with an air of practiced indifference, carefully placed a small, velvet-covered box, undoubtedly holding something extraordinarily expensive, onto a silk-draped pedestal. Arthur approached, his heart thrumming against his ribs. "Excuse me," he began, his voice sounding oddly small in the vast room. The coordinator turned, her gaze sweeping over him, taking in his slightly worn suit, his best, freshly pressed but clearly not haute couture, and then fixing on the humble package in his hands. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her features, not outright contempt, but a weary, practiced dismissal. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped, already moving on in her mind. Arthur held out his gift. "I have an item for the silent auction," he said, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. He explained his invitation, the scholarship program, the connection to the foundation. She listened, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting to the package, then back to his earnest face, a silent assessment taking place. "Right," she finally said, a sigh escaping her lips that was barely audible but carried the weight of her unspoken judgment. "Place it over there." She gestured vaguely towards a less prominent corner of the table, away from the glittering centerpieces, almost out of sight. It was a clear, unspoken instruction to minimize its presence, to tuck away the embarrassment. Arthur felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over him, but he clenched his jaw. This was for Lily. He walked to the designated corner, his steps feeling heavy, and carefully unwrapped his gift. The brown paper fell away, revealing the intricate carving of the miniature oak tree, its smooth wood gleaming faintly under the distant chandeliers. He placed it gently on the silk cloth, next to a pristine white envelope that contained the item's brief description and Arthur's contact information as instructed. As he stepped back, he saw it through their eyes. A piece of wood, beautifully made, yes, but utterly out of place. It was nestled between a limited edition designer handbag and a rare, signed first edition novel. He watched as a group of socialites, their laughter like wind chimes, drifted past, their eyes landing on his carving. One woman, her neck adorned with a cascade of diamonds, paused, a perfectly manicured hand lifting to point. A hushed giggle rippled through the group. "Oh, darling, is that a stick?" one of them whispered, loud enough for Arthur to hear. His blood ran cold. The other woman, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, responded, "Perhaps it's a rustic piece." A conversation starter, don't you think? More laughter. The phrase cheap gift echoed in his mind, searing itself into his consciousness. He felt a profound, burning shame, not for himself, but for the implication that Lily's love, his effort, could be so casually, cruelly dismissed. He wanted to snatch it back, to run, to disappear into the anonymity of the city night. But then, an image flashed in his mind. Lily's smiling face, her pure belief in his art. He straightened his shoulders, a quiet defiance hardening his gaze. He might be out of place, he might be judged, but he would not be broken. This gift, however cheap in their eyes, it was priceless to him and to Lily. He would stand his ground. The auctioneer, a charismatic man with a booming voice and a practiced smile, soon took the stage, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room hushed, a collective anticipation rippling through the crowd. He began with flowery introductions, praising the Wainwright Foundation, its noble cause, and the generosity of the esteemed guests. Arthur, standing near the back, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The moment of truth was approaching. He watched as the first few high-value items were brought forward, each eliciting eager bids and polite applause. He saw the auction coordinator cast a quick, almost imperceptible glance towards his corner of the table, a look that conveyed a mix of resignation and slight annoyance. He knew his small wooden sculpture would be a footnote, if even that, a moment of awkward silence or a forced, pitying bid. He braced himself, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. The auctioneer, still in full flow, gestured towards the silent auction display, promising an array of unique treasures for those who preferred a more discreet acquisition. Arthur watched as the man's eyes scanned the various items, moving from the diamond necklace to the rare painting, then slowly, almost hesitantly, towards the humble corner where the little oak tree carving sat. A microsecond of pause, a subtle shift in the auctioneer's expression, a flicker of something unreadable, just before he opened his mouth to speak. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the impending humiliation. No, the room felt suddenly too quiet, the air too thin. He could feel eyes, not just on the auctioneer, but on the very spot where his daughter's love sat exposed. He waited, dread pooling in his gut, for the inevitable condescending chuckle, the polite but dismissive comment about the charming rustic piece. He braced for the public judgment, for the final definitive stamp of his inadequacy in this world of gilded facades. His gaze was fixed on the auctioneer, whose lips were just beginning to form words, whose eyes were still lingering, strangely, on the simple wooden tree. He could hear the almost imperceptible rustle of a tuxedo jacket from the front row, a slight shift in posture. What would he say? How would he frame this ultimate misstep? The answer hung in the air, thick and heavy, horns like the silent judgment of 1,000 unforgiving eyes. What declaration would ring through the ballroom about Arthur's humble gift? The air within the grand ballroom, once a delicate symphony of muted clinks and polished whispers, began to shift, losing its veneer of polite indifference. What started as subtle glances and barely perceptible smirks, directed towards Arthur and the modest package clutched in his hand, had metastasized into something more overt, more pointed. The hushed murmurs around the lavishly adorned tables swelled, transforming into a cacophony of audible snickers and brazenly whispered criticisms that, in the cavernous space, seemed to bounce and amplify with cruel precision. Arthur, standing a little straighter than before, felt the warmth of 100 scrutinizing gazes upon him. His grip on the small, unassuming wooden bird tightened, its smooth, cool surface a quiet comfort against the rising tide of discomfort. It was a simple thing, hand-carved from a piece of reclaimed oak, painstakingly whittled over many late nights by Arthur himself, a labor of love intended as a quiet homage to the resilience of nature and a personal symbol of hope. To the uninitiated, or perhaps more accurately, to the aesthetically obtuse minds assembled here, it was nothing more than a crude, amateurish trinket. A child's toy, perhaps, mistakenly brought to an event where every accessory, every adornment, whispered tales of exorbitant cost and meticulous curation. Did you see what he's holding? A woman's voice, sharp and tinctured with incredulity, sliced through the general din. She's carrying with surprising clarity from a nearby table draped in shimmering silver. Her companion, a man whose tailored suit seemed to cost more than Arthur's annual salary, merely grunted, a sound of dismissive agreement. Looks like something found on the street, she continued, her tone dripping with feigned sympathy that barely concealed her disdain. A ripple of suppressed laughter followed, a wave of social cruelty washing over Arthur. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The heat of humiliation, usually a potent, debilitating force, flickered, but did not consume him. Instead, his mind, with the practiced agility of a single parent, navigating constant challenges, retreated to a sanctuary of memory. The quiet intensity in his daughter Lily's eyes as he showed her the finished bird, the way her small fingers had traced its unpolished curves, the genuine unvarnished joy on her face. That image, pure and untainted by the superficiality of this gilded cage, served as his anchor, his unshakable bulwark against the assault of judgment. He hadn't brought it for them. He had brought it because it was a piece of his heart, and he knew, with an unwavering certainty, that the true value of a gift lay not in its price tag, but in the love and effort it embodied. The centerpiece of the ballroom, a towering ice sculpture of a majestic swan, caught the light from the myriad chandeliers, scattering icy prisms across the polished marble floor. It was a dazzling, ephemeral display of wealth, melting slowly, irrevocably, just as Arthur felt the last vestiges of his composure might under the relentless glare. Yet, he stood firm. Now, he had promised Lily he would be brave. He had promised himself he would not be defined by the expectations of others, especially not by those who saw only the surface. A tall, impeccably dressed man, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, approached Arthur's peripheral vision. Mr. Alistair Finch, a prominent real estate magnate known for his ruthless business acumen and his penchant for public displays of superiority, paused beside him, ostensibly to admire a nearby art installation. But Arthur felt the weight of Finch's gaze, a palpable sneer radiating from his perfectly sculpted features. "Lost your way, old chap?" Finch's voice was low, but carried an edge of condescension that cut deeper than the previous whispers. He gestured subtly with a manicured hand towards the wooden bird. "That is certainly an interesting choice for a gala of this stature. We usually expect something a little more substantial. Something with a discernible provenance, perhaps?" Finch's eyes, devoid of genuine curiosity, swept over Arthur's slightly worn suit, then back to the bird, as if cataloging its every flaw. Arthur turned to face him fully, his gaze steady. "It is a gift, Mr. Finch," he stated simply, his voice calm, betraying none of the internal tremors. "Its value, I assure you, is deeply personal." Finch let out a soft, mirthless chuckle. "Personal value, you say? A quaint notion, particularly in a room where value is typically measured in far more tangible terms. Tell me, is it a project from a local artisan's workshop? A charity piece, perhaps? I'm always keen to support local endeavors, especially if they're quaintly rustic." The word rustic was pronounced with a theatrical flourish of disdain, turning it into an insult. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the magnet of social confrontation. Eager eyes, veiled behind the mask of polite interest, watched the unfolding drama. This was entertainment, a momentary deviation from the tiresome predictability of high society events. Arthur felt the spotlight intensify, the pressure mounting. "It's simply a gift," Arthur reiterated, his grip on the bird still firm. He would not explain it further. He would not justify his love or his choices to this man, or to any of them. The truth of the gift belonged to him and Lily, and perhaps to its intended recipient. Finch's smile tightened, his patience clearly wearing thin. Simply a gift, he mocked, and echoing Arthur's words. My dear fellow, this isn't a village fete. This is the annual Sterling Thorn Foundation Gala. Every item here, every contribution, every attendee reflects a certain standard. And frankly, your offering rather diminishes the occasion, don't you think? He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, weighted with implied threat. Perhaps you've misunderstood the nature of the event, or the generosity expected from its attendees. It was a direct challenge, a public shaming designed to corner and humiliate. Arthur felt the familiar ache of weariness in his bones, the legacy of countless sacrifices and battles, fought in quiet obscurity. He knew he could just walk away, deposit the bird on the designated gift table, and fade into the background, enduring the whispers until the night's end. But the image of Lily's beaming face flashed before him again, her tiny hand waving a crayon drawing she'd made for him, emblazoned with the words, "My daddy is brave!" He took a slow, deliberate breath. I understand the nature of the event perfectly, Mr. Finch, Arthur replied, his voice still low but imbued with a quiet resolve that seemed to surprise Finch. And I understand the meaning of generosity. Sometimes, true generosity isn't measured by the weight of a wallet, but by the weight of the heart behind the gesture. A shocked silence rippled through the immediate vicinity. Such defiance, delivered with such calm conviction, was utterly unexpected. It was a pattern interrupt in the carefully orchestrated symphony of social superiority. Finch's condescending smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine annoyance. His jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, least of all by someone he deemed so far beneath him. Just then, from across the vast expanse of the ballroom, a figure stirred. Sterling Thorn himself, the chairman of the foundation, a man whose presence commanded immediate attention without him ever having to demand it. He had been engaged in a conversation with a small group of prominent figures near the main stage, his demeanor typically reserved, almost regal. But now, his head tilted almost imperceptibly, his piercing gaze momentarily detaching from his interlocutors. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept across the room, past the glittering chandeliers, past the expensive gowns and tailored suits, landing for a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment on the small cluster of people gathered around Arthur. He couldn't possibly have heard the specifics of Finch's cutting remarks, or Arthur's quiet defense, not from that distance. Yet, there was something in the way his gaze lingered, a flicker of something unreadable in his usually impassive expression that sent a strange ripple through the air. It was a subtle shift, a barely noticeable alteration in the atmosphere, but it was enough to make some of the more observant socialites pause, their whispers dying on their lips. Mr. Thorne was known for his uncanny ability to perceive the nuances of a room, to detect even the slightest discord. Finch, emboldened by the chairman's implied proximity, and perhaps misinterpreting Thorne's brief glance, leaned closer to Arthur, lowering his voice conspiratorially, though still loud enough for those around to hear. Listen, friend, he hissed, the faux cordiality gone, replaced by naked menace. You're making a spectacle. And while I appreciate a good spectacle as much as the next man, this particular brand of impoverished charm is not welcome here. Perhaps you should reconsider your participation. This event is about significant contributions, about impact, not sentimental wood carvings. His eyes darted to the chairman, as if seeking confirmation or approval, though Thorne remained, outwardly at least, disengaged. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't afraid of Finch, not truly, but the sheer weight of their collective judgment, the implication that his very presence, his very existence, diminished this opulent affair, was suffocating. He thought of Lily again, her small hand in his, the warmth of her trusting gaze. He had come here with a purpose, driven by a hope he dared not speak aloud. And that hope, that purpose, was far greater than Finch's petty cruelty. He opened his mouth to respond, not with anger, but with a quiet dignity that was his only armor against their assaults. He would not be shamed into silence. He would not betray the love that had crafted this humble offering. The words were forming on his lips, a simple truth about integrity and heart when suddenly the air itself seemed to crackle. The general hum of conversation, which had momentarily dipped during Finch's aggressive monologue, now dropped precipitously, almost to a complete hush. It wasn't because of anything Arthur or Finch said. It was an unspoken collective acknowledgement. From the far end of the room, near the stage where he had been moments ago, Sterling Thorne was no longer merely observing. Sorum, he had begun to move. Slowly, deliberately, the chairman of the Sterling Thorne Foundation, a man who rarely deviated from a carefully planned itinerary, was making his way across the ballroom. His progress was a stately, inexorable procession. Heads turned, conversations died mid-sentence, and a path seemed to clear before him as if by invisible command. Every eye in the room, from the most jaded socialite to the most ambitious young entrepreneur, was now fixed upon him. He moved with an almost preternatural grace for a man of his age and stature, his gaze unwavering, directed not at Finch, not at the art, but seemingly with an unnerving precision straight towards Arthur. A new wave of intense curiosity, tinged with a delicious frisson of anxiety, swept through the assembled elite. What was happening? Why was Mr. Thorne, the usually aloof and impenetrable Titan, walking directly towards that man? The man with the cheap gift? The man who was just being publicly shamed? The collective breath of the gala seemed to catch, suspended in the shimmering, perfumed air. It was a re-engagement of the highest order, a sudden dramatic shift that seized everyone's attention, pulling them into the unfolding drama with an irresistible force. The chairman's steps, each one echoing with a profound sense of purpose, brought him closer and closer, and the question, unspoken but screaming in the minds of every guest, hung heavy in the silence. Why? And what precisely was he going to do? The air in the grand ballroom had not merely thickened, it had congealed into a palpable, suffocating substance, weighted by 1,000 unspoken judgments. David stood by the small, discreetly placed table where his offering, a simple unvarnished wooden bird, no larger than a man's palm, now rested. It looked utterly, tragically out of place amidst the glittering array of diamond necklaces, signed first editions, rare vintage wines, and original canvases from obscure yet exorbitantly priced modern artists that comprised the other auction items. Each piece was a testament to the guests' wealth, their connections, their sophisticated taste, or at least their ability to afford such taste. David's contribution, by stark contrast, was a stark, almost defiant declaration of something else entirely. The whispers, initially faint and sporadic, had escalated into a persistent, insidious hum, like a swarm of well-dressed, perfumed insects. They buzzed around him, through the marble columns, across the polished dance floor, and up into the vaulted ceilings, painted with cherubic frescoes. A wooden bird, is that all? One woman, adorned with an emerald as large as a pigeon's egg, scoffed to her companion, her voice carrying a little too far. Perhaps he's trying to make a statement. Her companion, a sleek man with a predatory smile, mused, a statement of what, exactly? Poverty chic? They both chuckled, a dry, brittle sound that grated on David's ears, but did not penetrate his composure. The disdain was so thick it could be cut with a jeweled knife, a palpable wave of collective scorn washing over the quiet man. David, however, remained an anchor in a swirling sea of derision. His gaze, distant yet steady, was fixed on nothing in particular, perhaps seeing beyond the gilded cage of the ballroom, beyond the superficiality of the present moment, no, to a quiet memory or a future promise. His hands, though not visibly trembling, were clasped loosely behind his back, a posture of quiet dignity rather than defensiveness. He wore his modest suit not as a costume of inadequacy, but as a uniform of purpose, one that allowed him to move through this opulent spectacle as an observer, rather than a participant in its shallow theatrics. He was acutely aware of the stares, the sidelong glances, the outright glares of disdain. He felt the weight of their collective scorn, not as a personal affront, but as a demonstration of their own smallness, their inability to see beyond the veneer of material wealth, their incapacity to grasp the profound significance of anything that did not bear a quantifiable price tag. This wooden bird, a small, unassuming carving, was more than just an object to him. It was a tangible piece of his daughter's joy, a symbol of their shared resilience, a testament to the simple, profound beauty they found in their own lives, far removed from the superficial grandeur of this charity gala. He had carved it himself, during countless late nights after Amelia had fallen asleep, using scraps of wood salvaged from an old fallen tree in a nearby park. Each feather, each curve of its tiny head, was etched with patience and love, a quiet prayer for his daughter's happiness. The grain of the wood, slightly worn from Amelia's tiny hands, told stories of laughter and comfort. He had wanted to contribute something meaningful, something that truly came from him, something that carried a piece of their world, not merely a purchased token. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that its intrinsic value far surpassed any jewel or artwork in the room, even if no one else could perceive it. It was a piece of his soul, a fragment of his profound fatherly love, made manifest in humble timber. The auctioneer, a man with an impossibly smooth voice and an even smoother toupee, had moved on, showcasing a particularly garish diamond brooch. His patter was a well-oiled machine of flattery and persuasive rhetoric, designed to extract the maximum possible bid from an already compliant audience. Yet, even as he expertly navigated the bids, a flicker of uncertainty, a momentary hesitation, could be detected in his usually flawless delivery whenever his gaze inadvertently swept over David's modest contribution. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the perfect matrix of the evening, a tiny crack in the veneer of polished professionalism. The wooden bird, in its stark simplicity, was disrupting the carefully orchestrated flow of consumerist generosity. From his vantage point on the elevated dais, the chairman, Mr. Alistair Finch, a figure of almost mythical stature in the city's philanthropic and corporate circles, observed the unfolding drama with an inscrutable expression. His eyes, though aged, possessed a piercing quality like polished obsidian, and they rarely left David. While the other guests chattered, drank expensive champagne, and occasionally cast disparaging glances David's way, Finch remained almost motionless, a silent sentinel. His gaze was not one of judgment or pity, but of intense, almost analytical scrutiny, occasionally softening into something akin to recognition. It was a subtle shift, barely perceptible to anyone else, but it was there, a fleeting shadow across the otherwise impenetrable mask he presented to the world. A shadow that hinted at a deeper, unrevealed connection. He hadn't participated in the initial rounds of mingling, preferring to survey the room with a quiet authority that required no loud pronouncements. His presence alone commanded respect, a gravity that pulled at the very fabric of the event. Now, as the auction progressed, his stillness became more pronounced, his focus narrowing like a laser beam on David. He seemed to be looking through the man's simple suit, through the polite facade, into something deeper, something resonant with his own hidden memories or long-held beliefs. It was a pattern interrupt in itself. The most powerful man in the room, ignoring the glittering prizes, yet ignoring the fawning sycophants, and fixing his entire attention on the unassuming single father. This was not the behavior of a man merely presiding over a charity event. It was the behavior of a man on the precipice of a significant discovery, or perhaps a long-awaited reunion. This persistent, unwavering observation from the chairman began to create its own subtle ripples through the room. Though most were too engrossed in their own self-importance or their whispered gossip to notice. A few of the more astute guests, however, those who understood the delicate dance of power and influence, began to feel a faint tremor of unease. They noticed the chairman's unusual focus, the way his jaw would subtly clench, or a faint twitch would play at the corner of his lips. They exchanged cautious glances, on a silent question passing between them. Why is he looking at him? This small, growing undercurrent of curiosity and apprehension acted as another pattern interrupt, subtly shifting the atmosphere from outright scorn to a hesitant, nascent confusion. The social hierarchy, usually so rigid, felt momentarily destabilized. One such observer was Marcus Thorne, a junior executive hoping to make a strong impression on Finch. He had initially joined in the collective snickering at David's gift, seeing it as an easy way to align himself with the prevailing sentiment. His laughter had been loud, perhaps a touch too boisterous, designed to be noticed by those higher up the corporate ladder. But now, seeing the chairman's unwavering gaze, a prickle of discomfort began to spread through him, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Now, Thorne was a master of reading a room, and this room was suddenly broadcasting a very confusing signal. He shifted his weight, his perfectly tailored suit feeling suddenly tight, his confident smirk faltering. What if, what if there was something he was missing? The thought was unsettling, an unexpected deviation from his carefully constructed social strategy. He had dismissed David as a pathetic, misguided fool, a laughable anomaly, but Finch's attention suggested otherwise. He decided then and there to temper his public disdain, just in case. It was a small but significant internal shift, driven purely by self-preservation and a keen understanding of the chairman's formidable influence. The prospect of being on the wrong side of Finch's silent judgment was a terrifying one. Meanwhile, David remained outwardly serene, though his internal landscape was a complex tapestry of emotions. He felt the cold shoulder of the elite, but it was a familiar sensation, one he had learned to navigate and even ignore. His resilience was forged in the fires of adversity, honed by countless sleepless nights and the unwavering responsibility of raising Amelia alone. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here to support a cause he believed in, a cause that helped children like his, even if the methods felt alien to his own humble existence. The wooden bird was his offering, his best, and he offered it without apology or expectation. He knew its true value, a value that transcended currency, that resonated with the deep, unspoken language of fatherly love and sacrifice. It was a piece of his heart, carved from wood and infused with love, a pure gesture in a room brimming with transactional gestures. He recalled Amelia's small, joyful face when he had shown her the finished carving. "It's a little bird, Daddy, just like the ones that sing outside our window," she had exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder, her tiny fingers tracing the delicate wings. "Will it fly far away?" He had smiled, touching her hair, a warmth spreading through him that defied the chill of the evening. "It will fly to someone who needs a little bit of magic, just like you do, sweet pea." That memory, warm and pure, was his shield against the chill of the ballroom, a private sanctuary in the midst of public scrutiny. He was not selling an object. He was sharing a piece of their quiet, resilient magic, a tangible symbol of hope. The auctioneer, sensing a lull and perhaps a slight awkwardness surrounding David's item, made a strategic decision to postpone its presentation for a few more rounds, hoping to re-inject some enthusiasm and gloss over the unconventional donation. He moved on to a rare collection of antique watches, describing their intricate mechanisms and historical significance with renewed gusto. This brief reprieve, however, only served to amplify the underlying tension. It was an acknowledgement of the elephant in the room, or rather, the wooden bird on the table, and the unspoken question of how to handle it. The delay only heightened the anticipation, creating a psychological space for speculation and rumor to fester. It was a subtle admission that David's gift was not just cheap, but problematic to the established order. The chairman, though silent, registered this deferment with a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. It was a subtle sign of displeasure, a hint that he saw through the auctioneer's superficial maneuvering, perhaps even viewing it as an affront. His gaze, still fixed on David, intensified, as if he were trying to communicate something across the vast, glittering expanse of the ballroom, something that transcended words. It was a powerful, almost unsettling connection, invisible to most, yet undeniably present, stretching like an invisible thread between the two men. David, perhaps attuned to this unspoken communication, or simply to the persistent weight of the chairman's observation, finally allowed his eyes to drift towards the dais. Their gazes met across the crowded room. There was no challenge in Finch's eyes, no condescension, only a deep, so penetrating stillness. For a fleeting moment, David felt as if time itself had paused, and the cacophony of the gala faded into a distant hum, replaced by the silent roar of a profound moment. In that silent exchange, David sensed an unexpected depth, a shared understanding that defied the chasm of their social standings. It was an unsettling, yet strangely comforting sensation. It was a pattern interrupt in his own carefully constructed emotional defense. This was not the typical dismissive stare he was used to. This was something else entirely, something that resonated with a distant echo in his own forgotten past. The questions swirling around David's past, questions that had been hinted at, but never explicitly answered in the prior parts, began to gain a new, subtle weight. Why did Alistair Finch, a man known for his impeccable memory and vast network, seem to recognize David? Was it from a distant past, a forgotten chapter, perhaps from a time before David's life had taken its current, humble turn? Was it a connection from a world David had long since abandoned, or been forced to abandon? The mystery deepened, woven into the very fabric of the unfolding evening, adding layers of intrigue to the simple wooden bird. The single dad, seemingly out of place, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming the true center of gravity for the most powerful man in the room, drawing all attention to himself, not through wealth or display, but through an inexplicable gravity of his own. The auctioneer, after several more successful bids on less controversial items, cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to signal the moment of truth, and he gestured towards David's table. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice regaining some of its usual theatrical flourish, though tinged with a carefully suppressed note of hesitancy, "we come to a truly unique item." He paused, perhaps for dramatic effect, or perhaps to gather his own courage. The room, which had momentarily dispersed into smaller conversational clusters, now redirected its collective attention, 100 pairs of eyes converging on David and the small wooden bird. The whispers resumed, this time laced with an added edge of anticipation, a morbid curiosity. Would anyone dare to bid on such a triviality? Or would it be met with humiliating silence, a public declaration of its worthlessness? David felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not of fear, but of an old, deep-seated weariness. He had faced far greater challenges than the judgment of a wealthy crowd. He braced himself, ready to accept whatever came, his composure an unyielding fortress. He had done his best, and that was all that truly mattered. The memory of Amelia's bright smile when she had first held the bird was his ultimate validation, a warmth that settled over him like a comforting blanket. He was prepared for their scorn, ready to absorb it with his customary quiet resilience. Suddenly, a resonant voice, clear and commanding, cut through the auctioneer's prepared remarks and the rising murmur of the crowd. It was Alistair Finch. He stood up slowly, deliberately, from his seat on the dais. The movement was unhurried, yet it possessed an undeniable authority that instantly silenced the entire ballroom. Every head turned, every conversation ceased, so every eye now fixed on the chairman. Even the auctioneer, mid-sentence, froze, his mouth agape, the words dying on his lips. The silence that descended was absolute, a stark contrast to the earlier cacophony, a profound stillness that resonated with the weight of Finch's authority. It was a dramatic, unexpected pattern interrupt that brought the entire proceedings to a grinding halt, drawing all focus away from the perceived worthlessness of the wooden bird and onto the chairman himself. Finch stood tall, his silver hair catching the ambient light, his eyes still holding that profound, unsettling focus on David. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood, allowing the weight of his presence and the sudden, profound silence to permeate every corner of the vast room, to settle heavy on every expectant guest. Some the air crackled with unspoken questions, with a tension so thick it felt almost breathable, a charged anticipation. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, their expressions ranging from utter confusion to awed anticipation. What was happening? Why was the chairman interrupting the auction? And why, above all, was he looking at him? The questions bounced silently off the marble walls, amplifying the suspense. David, for the first time that evening, felt a tremor of genuine surprise. His steady gaze met Finch's once more, searching for an explanation in the depths of those ancient, knowing eyes. He found none, only an unwavering intensity that seemed to promise a revelation, a profound shift in the very fabric of the evening. a seismic event waiting to unfold. The chairman's action was not a casual interruption, it was a deliberate, calculated move executed with the precision of a master strategist, clearly signaling an imminent, paradigm shifting announcement. The room held its breath, awaiting the chairman's words. The cheap gift, the single dad, the disdainful crowd, all now held captive by the impending declaration from the most powerful man in the room. The narrative had not reached its climax, but it was poised precariously on its very edge, every loose thread pulled taut, waiting for the pivotal unraveling that only Finch could initiate. The questions hung heavy in the air, creating an almost unbearable suspense, begging to be answered, yet remaining tantalizingly out of reach, prolonging the exquisite tension. What was the connection between these two disparate men? What secret did the chairman hold that could bridge such a vast social chasm? And how would this quiet man, David, be forever changed by the words that were about to be uttered? The stage was set, the players in their positions, and the grand reveal loomed, a whisper away from transforming the entire evening, the future, and the perception of every single person present. The sudden, resonant declaration of "Sir" hung in the air, a physical weight pressing down on the opulent ballroom. Every glittering chandelier seemed to dim in comparison to the sudden, incandescent spotlight that had involuntarily seized Liam O'Connell. The collective gasp, a unified exhalation of disbelief and curiosity, swept through the assembled titans of industry and society, leaving in its wake a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very hum of the building's ventilation system. No one coughed, no one shifted. All eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the unassuming figure standing by the stage, a man whose plain suit and humble demeanor now seemed to clash spectacularly with the gravitas of the chairman's address. It was an improbable tableau. The universally revered chairman, Robert Harrison, bowing his head in deference to a man previously dismissed as an interloper, a pauper amongst princes. The sheer improbability of the scene etched itself into the very fabric of the evening. Whispers, initially timid, then bolder, began to ripple through the room like a nervous tremor. Who was this man? What had he done? The questions hung unspoken yet palpable, thick with a mixture of suspicion, awe, and desperate curiosity. Robert Harrison, usually a figure of impenetrable composure, now stood with his shoulders slightly slumped, his gaze fixed on Liam with an intensity that spoke not of mere respect, but of a profound, almost reverential gratitude. His face, usually a mask of shrewd calculation, was now softened, etched with an emotion so deep it bordered on veneration, perhaps even regret for a past unacknowledged. The disparity between Liam's perceived low status and the chairman's profound reverence was a chasm of understanding that the crowd struggled desperately to bridge. The mystery of the cheap gift, momentarily forgotten, now loomed large, a silent accomplice to this bewildering drama. Robert Harrison took a slow, deliberate step towards the microphone, his movements heavy with an unspoken narrative. The air crackled with anticipation, every breath held, every thought silenced. He grasped the stand, his knuckles white, and for a moment, and simply surveyed the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the perplexed elite. When he finally spoke, his voice, though usually booming with authority, was now thick with an emotion that gave it a fragile, almost intimate quality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze settling back on Liam, "tonight, we are not merely celebrating philanthropy. We are bearing witness to something far more significant. The quiet return of a hero, a man who shaped not just my destiny, but the very foundation of this corporation, and indeed, countless lives." He paused, a sigh escaping him, laden with years of untold history. "Many decades ago," he continued, his voice gaining a steady rhythm, pulling the listeners into his narrative, "I was a young man, ambitious perhaps, but certainly naive. I was a junior executive in a struggling engineering firm. It is one that teetered on the brink of both financial ruin and a catastrophic ethical collapse. We were on the verge of launching a massive infrastructure project, a new bridge that promised to redefine urban connectivity. But beneath the gleaming blueprints and the enthusiastic rhetoric, there was a terrible secret, a fundamental flaw, a design miscalculation so egregious that it threatened to turn a marvel of engineering into a tomb. The ballroom, which moments before had been a cauldron of speculation, now fell into an almost eerie quiet. The weight of his words, of the potential for disaster, hung heavy. Eleanor and Richard, who had been sneering just moments ago, now exchanged nervous glances, their earlier derision replaced by a dawning comprehension that something monumental was unfolding. The pressure, Mr. Harrison recounted, his eyes distant, lost in the past, was immense. Millions of dollars had been invested. Careers hung in the balance. The easy path, the path most were pushing for, was to sweep the flaw under the rug, to push the project through, to hope for the best, to hope that the worst wouldn't happen, or at least wouldn't happen on our watch. It was a dark time, a time when integrity was a luxury few could afford, or so it seemed. He then turned his full attention to Liam. Amidst this moral quagmire, there was one individual, a junior engineer, barely out of university, who possessed a courage and an ethical fortitude that shamed us all. He was not swayed by power, not intimidated by threats, not tempted by silence. He saw the truth, understood the horrific implications, and refused to let it stand. A collective ripple went through the crowd. A junior engineer? The implications began to dawn on some of the older attendees who had lived through similar corporate scandals. Mr. Harrison's voice, now imbued with a profound solemnity, rang through the hushed hall. That junior engineer, who risked his entire future, his livelihood, his very professional existence, to stand for what was right, against the full might of corporate greed and desperation, was the man standing beside me tonight, Liam O'Connell. The revelation hit the room like a sonic boom. Whispers, then murmurs, then a sudden, stunned silence descended once more. The pieces began to click into place for some, particularly for those few who remembered the seismic shift in the engineering world decades ago. But the quiet redesign of the infamous Riverbend Bridge project, a redesign attributed to an anonymous whistleblower and a mysterious, innovative solution. No one had ever known the full story or the identity of the hero. Now, he stood before them, in a plain suit, holding a simple package. Eleanor and Richard, their faces now completely drained of color, could only stare, their earlier contempt morphing into a ghastly understanding of their own profound error. The mockery they had so freely dispensed now clung to them like a shroud of shame. Mr. Harrison's gaze softened as he reached for the small, wrapped package Liam had brought. His hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly as he began to peel back the modest wrapping paper. Inside, nestled in a simple, unadorned box, was not a glittering jewel, not a rare antique, no, but a small, unassuming object. He lifted it gently, holding it aloft for all to see. It was a miniature structural support beam, crudely fashioned from what appeared to be scrap metal, perhaps a sturdy piece of pipe or rebar, meticulously shaped and welded. It was rough, unfinished, and bore the marks of being handmade, yet its form was undeniably precise, a perfect scaled representation of a critical architectural element. This, Mr. Harrison announced, his voice imbued with a newfound strength and almost evangelical fervor, is not merely a trinket. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a relic. It is the very first, hastily fabricated, but perfectly conceptualized, support beam prototype that Mr. O'Connell, Liam, sketched, then crafted from scrap metal in his small apartment workshop. He created this tirelessly, and then over several sleepless nights, to visually demonstrate his solution to me, to a skeptical engineering team, and to a board of directors desperate to avoid disaster. He clutched the miniature beam as if it were the most precious artifact on Earth. Just hours before the Riverbend Bridge structure was scheduled to undergo its final fatal stress test, a test it would not have survived, Liam O'Connell anonymously delivered this to my desk. He included an urgent, meticulously detailed report that exposed the flaws in the original design and proposed this exact innovative fix. He didn't seek credit. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't ask for a promotion or a reward. He simply did what was right. He put his entire future on the line, sacrificing his promising career trajectory within that cutthroat corporation to save countless lives. And by extension, he saved my nascent career, the reputation of our entire industry, and averted a national tragedy. A collective, shuddering breath swept through the room. The sheer magnitude of Liam's quiet heroism, his selflessness, his courage, was now laid bare. The cheap gift, initially an object of scorn, was instantly transmuted into an artifact of immeasurable value, a silent testament to an act of profound integrity. After averting the disaster, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion, Liam O'Connell quietly disappeared from that corporate world. He saw the corruption, the moral compromises, and he chose a different path. He vanished, leaving no forwarding address, no contact information. He embraced a simpler life, choosing to raise his daughter, Amelia, with the unwavering principles he lived by. I searched for him for years, desperate to thank him, to repay him, to simply acknowledge the debt I owed him. But he had become a ghost, a legend whispered among the few who knew the true story of the Riverbend rescue. This miniature beam, he lifted it again, was the only tangible link, the only piece of evidence I had of the incredible man who had saved me. He then looked directly at Liam, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Tonight, after all these decades, this man, Liam O'Connell, who asked for nothing, accepted no praise, and simply did what was right, has returned to me this very symbol of his quiet heroism. He is not just a man. He is a beacon of integrity, a living embodiment of courage. He is the true architect of this corporation's ethical foundation. He saved lives, he saved my career, and he taught me, saying more than any mentor, the true meaning of leadership, of responsibility, and of unwavering moral conviction. That is why, Robert Harrison concluded, his voice ringing with absolute certainty and profound reverence, that is why I call him Sir. He is more than just a man. He is a master of character, a profound example to us all. The revelation caused a tsunami of shame and admiration to wash over the room. The people who had mocked Liam, who had openly sneered at his humble appearance and the perceived insignificance of his gift, now felt the full, crushing weight of their own superficiality. Richard and Eleanor stood frozen, their faces pale, their earlier arrogance replaced by a visible, sickening realization of their profound misjudgment. The very air around them seemed to thicken with unspoken apologies and regret. The snickers, the derisive whispers, the haughty glances, they all returned to haunt their perpetrators, ghosts of their own making. Liam, still humble, still radiating an aura of quiet dignity, slowly approached Mr. Harrison. There was no triumph in his eyes, no vindication, only a serene understanding. He reached out not to take the miniature beam, but to gently place a hand on Robert Harrison's shoulder. "It was time, Robert," Liam said, his voice soft yet clear, cutting through the stunned silence. Amelia needed to see it. She needed to understand that true value isn't measured in gold, but in courage, in honesty, in what you leave behind for others. As he spoke, Liam's gaze met Amelia's. His daughter, who had watched this entire unfolding drama with a mix of confusion, hurt, and now profound awe, stood transfixed. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming pride and love. She now understood not just who her father was, but what he was. He was a hero, not of grand gestures, but of quiet, unyielding integrity. The cheap gift, once a symbol of his perceived poverty, had been transmuted in that instant into the most invaluable, the most cherished item in the entire room, a lighthouse guiding a lost ship home. The gala, which had begun as a mere display of opulence and social climbing, had been fundamentally transformed. It had become a testament to something far greater than wealth, to integrity, to sacrifice, to the quiet power of a single moral act. The power dynamics of the room had shifted irrevocably. Eleanor and Richard, along with all those who had judged Liam, were exposed not as the elite, but as the truly impoverished in spirit. The glittering facade of the evening cracked, revealing the raw, undeniable truth of human character. The profound silence that settled over the room was no longer one of confusion or judgment, but one of introspection, of a deeply felt respect. It was a silence filled with a new kind of understanding, a shift in values. As the crowd watched Liam O'Connell, the quiet hero, gently embrace his long-lost friend Robert Harrison, and then turn to his daughter, a silent promise exchanged between them. The true cost of integrity versus the price of gold echoed in every corner of the transformed ballroom. It was a lesson etched forever into the hearts of all who bore witness. A story whispered from that night forward of the single dad, his cheap gift, and the chairman who called him Sir,